I tell you what, with the questions that people are asking right now, and it was funny, I got a ton of comments from one of our videos last week about the house affordability. I think a lot of the comments was the example I used was a $400,000 house, and a lot of people are like, where is that? That are not, from our local market, but on a national scale. So it was great. Thank you, everybody, for the comments on that. But the question I kept getting over and over again this week was, how can we buy a new house, move up, and not be homeless? And so that leads to the question of what a contingent offer is. But it's not so much just the buyers that were asking that question. We had a number of sellers that were receiving, because activity really spiked the last 2 weeks. And we're going to talk a little bit about that with interest rates. But we had a lot of our sellers asking, should I consider a contingent offer? What does that mean for me, Lance? What does that look like? And so by the time I get this, like I either see like the fourth transaction or the fourth question come across my desk, I'm like, okay, this is the radio topic for this week. And so one of the things that we are seeing happening right now is we are seeing more and more contingent offers. So yes, rates have come down. So what that's done is that's spiked buyer activity, but the rates are still not low enough to where the majority of people can afford to have two houses at one time. So that leads us into the contingent offer, which in very layman terms means that I will buy your house for X. Let's say it's $600,000. I will buy your house for $600,000, contingent that I can sell my $400,000 house, in the next 45 days. So like the default in our contract is 45 days. So what that means is that we have an agreement. We're fully negotiated on purchasing your $600,000 house. We've got all the terms set, but we're not going to do anything until I've now got to put my house on the market and get a buyer locked in on my house. And so there's that. What it does is it creates a massive amount of moving parts there. And one of the reasons why this is happening is, let's say, and it's really happening especially in what I call move up price ranges. So in your market, if move up price point is 600, 700, 800,000, you have to look at that. And what I mean by that is that the likeliest buyer for your house has owned a house for, let's say, the last 5 to 10 years. They've run out of space. They want a nicer home. They've saved up some money. And so they are moving up in price point to your house. Well, to do that, a lot of the equity that people have, it's tied up in their existing home. Not a lot of people can say like, man, and so what they're looking at and they're saying is, hey, I bought my house for $250 10 years ago. Now it's worth $450. But I don't have that cash necessarily. But now I've paid it down some. Say I've paid it down to $150. It's worth $400. I got $300,000 worth of equity there. Man, now I can go look at, I can afford a $300,000 mortgage. So if I put that with my equity, man, now I can go look at the $600,000 houses. But the equity is tied up in that house, and I'm not ready to make two payments. Like I can't just go throw down, get another mortgage for the 600 and be making the payments, until mine sells. Yeah. And so we look at, okay, what are we going to look at with a contingent offer? Well, when you're a seller evaluating this, the first thing, because sellers have to say, what does this do to the marketability of my home? And so the first thing that every seller asks in this situation is they say, well, Lance, what if we agree to this and then 4 days later we get a better offer, or we get an offer that's non-contingent, meaning they don't have a house to sell? Like, should I just wait for that? You've got to evaluate total activity in your price point, total activity. How long have you been on the market? So, how many offers have you had so far? If any, is this your first offer? And so you've got to make a judgment call on that. And a lot of times in a move up situation, you can look and say like, okay, is my $600,000 house more likely to sell than their $400,000 house. So let's say that's a first-time homebuyer pool, and we have a ton of millennials getting to the age of purchasing, and even Gen Z, and so are there more buyers? And statistically, there are, because we know they're now making up 35% of buyers, where move-up buyers might only be like 20. So you got to say, statistically, man, there's a better chance that $400,000 house is going to sell than mine. And so let's take that chance. But your question about what if I get an offer 4 days later? I enter into this agreement, I get an offer 4 days later. There is in the home sale contingency what is called a bump clause.
Okay.
And so what that means is that your house will continue to be marketed as what's called active with a bump. And so you just think of it like, I'm going to bump that other buyer out of the way. So I'm non-contingent. I don't have a house to sell. So you show a house that's active, with a bump, and you then say like, okay, yeah, we're not contingent. Let's put an offer in. You put an offer in. You fully negotiate that second offer. You get great terms. They're non-contingent. What you then are required to do is that second offer is contingent upon the first offer going out of what's called first position, getting bumped. So it's a negotiated time period. The contract default says, hey, if you get another offer, you have to give us notice, and then we have 5 days to either have our other house sold or waive our contingency. And we're going to talk about waiving contingencies after the break. But what you can do is you can negotiate that time period. So as a seller, you're like, okay, will someone wait 5 days for an answer? Well, it's a long time, especially in our TikTok and Instagram world that we live in, right? Like waiting 5 days for an answer, like people get antsy. So you can look at that and say, well, let's negotiate that. Like, yes, I do want to sell to this contingent buyer, but maybe it's more reasonable to have 2 days. Like they can either get that house sold, they either have financing in place, they can waive it, or I just want them to say they can't do either of those and get out of the way. And I'd much rather know in 2 days than I would in 5. So from a seller's perspective, that's the case. From your buyer, as you're negotiating, you're looking at that saying, man, if I'm going to get bumped and I only have 2 days to make a decision, I better already know what I'm doing if I get bumped. And so you can just talk to your agent about strategies like, man, could I afford this for 60 days with both payments? Could I get approved for a bridge loan to waive my contingency? And so we'll talk about, Lance, what are you talking about waiving this contingency? Well, there's a strategy with being contingent. We're going to talk about that when we come back from the break. So there's a lot to be thinking about in these situations. It's totally doable. And in fact, before I got into the studio, I looked in the market and we're running at about 15% of pending properties right now in our market are contingent upon another house selling. But a lot of people will ask, they'll say, well, Lance, why wouldn't I do a contingency? So let's look at the other side of the coin. Like what are the risks associated with accepting a contingent offer on my property? So a lot of people think like, oh man, is there any downside to this? Well, I'll tell you there is a little bit, because what you generally will see is, even though it is still showing on sites like Zillow and Realtor.com and all of our advertising, to the public facing site it is showing as active. To the agent facing site, you have to indicate that there's an offer on the property. So it is showing active with a bump. Well, a lot of clients, they will say that they don't want to go through the emotional roller coaster of bumping somebody out of a property or waiting to hear. So what do I mean by that? Well, the way that contingency is written is you get the seller to give you a contingency based upon selling your other house. Well, if you get put into a bump position, there is a clause in there that, as the buyer says, so if you can afford to own both houses and you really, really want the other house, you can, when you're given that bump notice that there's another non-contingent offer, you can waive your buyer sale contingency as long as you can prove financially that you can afford both houses. You can waive the buyer sale contingency and just move straight forward to closing. So here's the situation you can imagine that people get themselves into. A second buyer comes along. The buyer absolutely loves the house, as the sellers accepted a contingent offer. But the reason they accepted a contingent offer is because that contingent buyer said, man, I really this is our dream house, but man, it makes it so much easier if we can take the money from our first house, use that as our down payment, simultaneously close everything. And we could, if push came to shove, we could afford that house. Okay. But we just want to be contingent on selling our other house. So along comes buyer number 2. It is their dream house. They love it. They're not contingent. They're ready to go. They say, Lance, show us. This is the house we've been looking for 9 months. Let's bump these other fools out of the way and let's get this house. So we put in an offer, non-contingent. We're strong down payment. It's a 5-day bump, and we're like, okay, well, we're going to see if they sell their other house or what happens. And they get that bump notice. The first buyer gets the bump notice, and they said, you know what? Even though it's risky, even though we're going to have 2 payments for the next, however long it takes our house, this is just it for us. We can afford. We're going to waive our contingency. So we waive that. So they waive their contingency and they move to closing. And so here's Lance. Here I am sitting with my buyer. And they're in my office and they're crying and there's tears, and the kids are like, oh, I'd already picked out my bedrooms and we've been looking for 9 months. Now, Lance, we have to go look for 9 more months. And they're just emotionally wrecked. They didn't get it. They put in a good offer. They didn't get it. Now we go out and look at houses next week. And John, guess what happens when I look at houses with that couple next week? Guess what they say about every single house that I show them?
It's not like the one we like.
You nailed it. And so that takes a while to get over. And sometimes people have gone through that situation and they're like, hey, you know what? I can't handle it again. Like, I want to know the next house we get, we actually have a chance at. And that's not always the case, but sometimes it is the case. And so when you're a seller, you have to say, like, okay, our showings are probably going to decrease, but this is a good offer. It's contingent, but we like the terms. It's going to work for us financially. We haven't seen a ton of action, so we're going to potentially consider this. But just know that then showings will likely decrease. Now, I will tell you, I have had happen too, and you just never know in these situations. So you have to think about all angles. I have had happen houses that have been on the market for 3 months, and we've had 1 or 2 really lowball offers, but then we get a contingent offer and we list it as contingent, as now. And it's like, because somebody else wanted it, somebody else wants it. And so then you immediately, like 4 days later, you get a bump offer and you're like, where were all of these people the first, 80 days? So I have had it in times actually generate more activity, but I would say that's the exception and not the norm, in a lot of those cases. So those are kind of both sides of what we see happen with contingent offers. And in our current market state, I think the overall principle is that you have to consider them, because they're a mechanism that's out there. And so especially still with where rates are. So in that environment, when rates were 2.5%, no one cared because they could afford to have, 2 or 3 houses. So they would like, oh, just buy the next one. My payment's on next to nothing. But that's not the case anymore. And so there were a lot of people, 3 years ago, a lot of agents and people in the business where they're like, the seller won't even consider contingent. Like, it's just, we have so much activity that we won't even consider contingent. That's not the current market that we're in now. But things go up and down, and you have to look at everything that's going on and then make a decision that's best for you as the seller or the buyer. So I think the overall summary is you have to consider them, but just know there are a lot of minute details wrapped up within those that you need to have a good long talk with your agent about how you're going to handle that. If you have any questions about being in a situation like that or what that looks like, Go to kenmoreteam.com, shoot me a message, and we will be right back here next week talking about real estate.